A family is the most fragile unit we have. One moment, it's held together by dreams, struggles, and the simple rhythm of everyday life. The next, it can vanish, without reason, without explanation, without a trace. In October of 2009, Bois and Sherilynn Jamison, along with their 6-year-old daughter Madyson, left their home in Red Oak, Oklahoma, to look at a piece of land in the Bois Mountains. It should have been an ordinary trip, the kind families take every day in search of a better future. But the Jamisons never came back. Days later, their truck was found abandoned on a lonely dirt road. Inside were their wallets, IDs, cell phones, and even their beloved dog, left starving. And on that phone, a single photograph of little Madyson, an image so haunting it still chills investigators today. This is not just a disappearance. It's a crime scene that defies every logical explanation, a mystery where every answer only leads to more questions. If you want these forgotten stories brought to light and to honor the Jamison family's memory, subscribe now and share your thoughts below. What do you think happened to the Jamison family after that final photograph was taken?
Search intensifies tonight for a Eufaula family of 3 missing for about 2 weeks now. Rescue crews are searching on the ground and in the air near Red Oak, that's in Latimer County. News 9's Dan Bewley has today's developments.
Bois and Sherilynn Jamison were residents of Red Oak, Oklahoma, a place where people leave lights on for neighbors and where the cadence of small-town life can feel steady and predictable. Bois, in his mid-40s, lived with chronic back pain after an earlier car accident and had limited capacity for heavy work. Friends described him as quiet and thoughtful, a man burdened by physical pain but steady in his devotion to family. Sherilynn, near 40, was known for blunt candor and a fierce protectiveness. She carried the strain of managing bipolar disorder and the practical burdens of household life. Together they raised their daughter, Madyson, who was 6 at the time of their disappearance. Madyson was a small child with ready curiosity. She liked bright dresses and dolls, and she loved when her parents read to her at night. Their household did not stand out for wealth or notoriety, but for the combination of endurance, affection, and the daily negotiations of hardship that characterized many American families. The Jamisons nurtured a clear, tangible hope: 40 acres of land in the Bois Mountains. To them, the tract represented more than acreage. It was a promise of quieter days and a place to carve out a new life. They spoke openly about moving a storage shed onto the parcel and converting it into a simple dwelling while they worked to make the site livable. The Bois area, with its low ridgelines, dense trees, and unpaved tracks, offered seclusion that appealed to a family seeking relief from financial pressures and persistent health concerns. For Bois and Sherilynn, the property was a practical plan and an emotional anchor. It suggested a chance to be less dependent on others, to shelter their little family from prying eyes and mounting bills, and to give Madyson room to grow where the nearest neighbor might be a mile away. The plan to purchase the land was known to relatives and neighbors. It was not a secret, but a stated ambition that shaped their conversations and decisions in the months before October 2009. Despite that practical planning, pressures accumulated. Bois had become estranged from his father over long-standing disputes, and other family relationships were frayed. Money troubles added stress, and Sherilynn's struggles with mood disorder sometimes contributed to volatility in daily life. Neighbors later told investigators that the Jamisons occasionally remarked that they felt watched or that someone was after them. Those comments were intermittent and often expressed as passing unease rather than a continuous, documented paranoia. Still, after the family disappeared, those stray remarks took on new weight. In small communities, such details are the kind of context that investigators record. Offhand comments, recurring arguments, and the thin threads of fear that can run through a household. For the Jamison family, the mix of aspiration and anxiety would prove to be a stubborn and haunting backdrop to what followed. On October 8, 2009, the Jamisons set out for a routine trip to the Bois Mountains to view the parcel they hoped to purchase. They loaded their white pickup truck with the sorts of items a family takes for a day in the woods: a GPS unit to help navigate the unmarked tracks, cell phones, water, snacks, and spare clothing. They brought Maisie, their small dog, who was a constant companion. The outing looked ordinary to anyone who might have seen them pass. A family making logistical preparations, checking maps, and talking quietly about measurements and access points. There was no apparent haste, no visible reason to suspect danger in the moments before departure. To the Jamisons, this trip was part of the practical business of buying land, to walk boundary lines, to envision where a storage shed might sit, and to decide whether the site matched their needs. A trail-style camera on their property recorded the last known images of the family before they left. Investigators would later study the footage closely, pausing on small gestures and repeated motions as if the frames might disclose a motive or a clue. The clips show Bobby and Sherilynn moving between the house and the truck with focused purpose, carrying bags and securing doors. They do not shout or rush. There are no dramatic gestures and no visible struggle. That ordinariness became itself a mystery. Why did people who looked calm and prepared vanish into a landscape that would later hold more questions than answers? Was the quiet a sign of ordinary focus, or did it mask something else: medication, exhaustion, or a private fear? The camera provided a record of departure, but no explanation of what followed on the roads ahead. They drove from Red Oak into the folded country of the Bois Mountains, where tracks narrow and trees close in. As the afternoon gave way to evening, the Jamisons had not returned. Family members tried to call. Phones went unanswered. Text messages accumulated without reply. Concern moved quickly from uneasy to urgent. When the hours lengthened and no contact was made, relatives filed a missing persons report. Local sheriff's deputies, volunteers, and neighbors began searching the likely routes, the small bridges and hollows where a vehicle might stop, and the property the family planned to visit. The early effort was practical and methodical, attempting to reconstruct a simple excursion that had become something else entirely. At the Jamisons' home, deputies found an environment that suggested an ordinary departure rather than a frantic flight. Maisie, the family dog, was left inside, pacing and crying, an animal that indicated its people had left without preparation. Wallets and identification remained in the house. Personal items lay where one would expect them to be. The absence of such indicators shaped the first layer of investigative thinking. This did not look like a home invaded in rage. Neighbors described the family with equal parts affection and concern. Bobby's patience and Sherilynn's protective bluntness were remembered most. Madyson, 6 years old, was the small light in the household. Eager, quick to smile, fond of dolls and simple routines. For a town like Red Oak, Oklahoma, the disappearance of a local family became an all-consuming worry. Investigators turned to the thin anchors of evidence. The game camera footage, which recorded a calm departure, cell phone pings that hinted at travel into the Sands Bois, and scattered witness recollections about a truck seen on certain dirt tracks that day. Those fragments offered directions for searchers, but not answers. They also raised quiet, terrible questions that would echo in the months to come. Why would a family known to be practical and cautious journey into remote country and then fail to return? What had they encountered on the trackless roads of the Sands Bois Mountains? How could an ordinary family outing become the opening chapter of an Oklahoma cold case? The Jamison family's plan for new land had become, instead, an unsettled chapter in local memory, a missing family story that demanded explanation and left people asking for closure. When a family fails to return home, the first hours matter most. For the Jamisons, those first hours stretched into days. At first, relatives thought perhaps Bobby and Sherilynn had decided to extend their outing, to stay overnight on the land or with a friend nearby. But as time passed with no word, the likelihood of a simple delay diminished. Calls to their cell phones went unanswered. No charges appeared on bank accounts. No messages reached family members or friends. In a town the size of Red Oak, news spread quickly. By the weekend, the question was on everyone's lips. Where were the Jamisons? Search efforts began across Latimer County and into the Sands Bois Mountains. Local deputies coordinated with volunteers. Roads were checked, property lines walked, and areas near creeks and hollows scanned. Helicopters flew over the rugged terrain, where thick trees and steep slopes limited visibility. Search dogs were brought in to try to pick up a scent. The area was known for being difficult, dense undergrowth, old logging trails, and paths that could confuse even experienced locals. Still, no sign of the family emerged. Then, on October 16th, 8 days after their disappearance, deputies made a discovery that remains one of the most unsettling crime scenes in Oklahoma history. On a remote dirt road in the mountains, searchers spotted the Jamisons' white pickup truck. It was parked, not wrecked. There were no signs of skidding, no broken branches, no impact. It was simply sitting on the track, as if abandoned. Dust had gathered on the surface, but the vehicle itself was intact. Inside the truck was a scene that confounded every assumption investigators might have carried into the search. The Jamisons' dog, Maisie, was found alive but severely malnourished, trapped inside the vehicle for days. The small animal had survived without food or water, pawing at the windows, waiting for a family that never returned. For searchers, the sight of Maisie was at once a small relief and a profound horror. Relief that the dog had lived, horror that a family had left her behind. Scattered inside the cab were Bobby and Sherilynn's wallets, their driver's licenses, their credit cards. Cell phones rested inside the truck as well. A GPS unit was found, switched off. A bank bag containing approximately $32,000 in cash was tucked inside. There was no indication of robbery. There were no broken windows, no forced entry, no blood. The truck was full of the kinds of belongings a family would never willingly abandon, especially in remote mountain country. The details drew sharper questions with each new revelation. Why would anyone walk away from wallets and phones? Why leave a beloved pet to starve? Why abandon cash, especially for a family known to be struggling financially? The evidence pointed to an interrupted moment, as though the Jamisons had stepped out intending to return quickly, only to be overcome by something unexpected. Investigators considered everything: a flat tire, a sudden argument, an outside threat, a lure into the woods. But with each possibility came contradictions. The truck was in working order. There were no footprints that clearly led away. No neighbors nearby had heard shouting or gunfire. For the Jamison family, the abandoned vehicle became the central artifact of the mystery. It stood as the last trace of their physical presence, a mute witness on a dirt road surrounded by forest. Deputies took note of every item, every angle, every detail. The dog was removed and taken into care. The cash, the phones, the IDs, all were secured as evidence. Photographs were taken. Still, none of it provided an answer. Then came the discovery of what many consider the most haunting clue in the entire case. On Bobby's cell phone, investigators found a photograph of Madyson taken during the family's trip. The image showed the 6-year-old standing in the woods, arms crossed tightly, her expression deeply unsettled. Some saw fear in her eyes. Others thought she looked vacant, as though caught in a trance or overcome by exhaustion. The background was indistinct, trees and brush without clear landmarks. There was no timestamp indicating precisely when the picture had been taken. To law enforcement, it was an ambiguous piece of evidence, unmistakably real, but impossible to interpret with certainty. Yet to the public, once news of the photo emerged, it became the case's enduring image. A little girl staring into the camera, expressionless or frightened, caught in a frame that may have been her last known moment alive. Families across Oklahoma and beyond studied the picture, trying to understand what was happening in that instant. Was she cold? Afraid? Had she seen something? Was someone forcing her to pose? The photograph became a haunting symbol of the case, an artifact that raised more questions than it answered. Investigators pressed into the details. The phone contained no other images that pointed to trouble. GPS coordinates showed the truck's path into the mountains. Search teams combed the surrounding woods for clues, focusing on a radius around where the photograph might have been taken. But in the thick tangle of trees and ridges, nothing conclusive emerged. No clothing, no tracks, no campfire remains, no signs of a struggle. For Bobby and Sherilynn's relatives, the discoveries were bewildering. Why would a couple carrying $32,000 in cash leave it behind? Why would they take their daughter into the mountains only to vanish within a few miles of their own vehicle? Why would they abandon Maisie, a dog they loved, inside a locked truck? Theories began to surface almost immediately. Some speculated that the money was connected to drugs, perhaps an attempted purchase that had gone wrong. Others wondered if the Jamisons had been meeting someone in the woods, perhaps to finalize the land deal, and had fallen victim to foul play. Still others considered that the family might have staged a disappearance, planning to start over elsewhere. But each theory ran into the same problem. The belongings left in the truck made no sense if the departure had been voluntary. The haunting photo of Madyson deepened the confusion. Investigators released limited details about it, aware of the sensitivity. But even in their measured statements, the image was described as unsettling, a child captured in a moment that could not be explained. Meanwhile, search efforts expanded. Hundreds of volunteers scoured the Sans Bois Mountains on foot, on horseback, and with all-terrain vehicles. Cadaver dogs were brought in, alerting at times to areas that were dug or examined, though no remains were found. Helicopters scanned for disturbances in the canopy. Streams and ponds were checked for signs of drowning. Each effort ended the same way: with no trace of the Jamisons beyond the truck and the photograph. Days turned into weeks. Weeks stretched into months. The abandoned vehicle remained the case's immovable centerpiece, parked on a lonely dirt road, its contents cataloged but never fully explained. For investigators, the truck was both a lead and a dead end. It told them the Jamisons had reached the mountains. It showed they had been alive long enough to leave their belongings inside. It gave them the photograph of Madyson, but it told them nothing about where they went or why. Public fascination grew as news outlets covered the case. The narrative was compelling. A family gone without a trace, a truck full of belongings, a child's haunting photograph, and a remote mountain range swallowing all evidence. For many, it echoed the folklore of families lost in wilderness or travelers vanishing on lonely roads. But this was no legend. It was a modern cold case, documented with GPS coordinates, cell phone records, and the stubborn reality of unanswered questions. Investigators pressed into the Jamisons' background. They interviewed family and friends. They reviewed medical histories, financial records, and personal disputes. The portrait that emerged was complicated but not conclusive. There were tensions, health issues, and hints of fear, but no definitive explanation for the truck, the dog, the money, and the missing family. And always, the photograph lingered. That single image of Madyson stood as the most visceral clue. Parents across Oklahoma said they could not shake it from their minds. To look at the photo was to confront the enormity of the mystery in one child's face. Why abandon a vehicle with everything needed to survive? What does the photograph of Madyson truly reveal? Was it fear, fatigue, or the frozen image of a child in the final hours before something unthinkable occurred? The Jamison family's disappearance had moved beyond the borders of Latimer County. It had become a statewide enigma, one that investigators could not ignore and one the public would not forget. The abandoned truck, the starving dog, the wallets, the cash, and the photograph of Madyson were enough to make the Jamison case one of the most confounding mysteries in recent Oklahoma history. But the unanswered questions were only the beginning. Once investigators turned their focus inward into the family's background, their daily lives, and their state of mind in the weeks leading up to October 2009, the story became even more complex. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation joined the Latimer County Sheriff's Office in the case. They began by tracing the family's last known movements. Witnesses confirmed seeing the Jamisons driving in the direction of the Sans Bois Mountains on the day they vanished. Beyond that, hard sightings ended. GPS data from the device in their truck showed they had driven into the mountains, navigated some of the smaller roads, and stopped at various points before eventually parking where the truck was found. But those coordinates provided no clue as to what made them leave the vehicle. Deputies combed through the truck's contents, cataloging each item in hopes of finding a lead. There was no note, no journal entry, no indication of who they might have been meeting. The cache raised questions immediately. Why were Bobby and Sherilynn carrying $32,000? The family was not wealthy. In fact, financial stress had been a recurring theme in their lives. Some relatives said they believed the money may have been an inheritance or savings intended for the land purchase. Others speculated it might have been connected to other dealings. But the presence of so much cash, left untouched, complicated every theory. Investigators spoke at length with family members. Several said that in the weeks before the disappearance, Bobby and Sherilynn had both expressed feelings that someone was out to harm them. The nature of those fears was unclear. At times, Bois spoke of people plotting against them. At other times, Sherilynn mentioned seeing spirits or sensing evil in their home. In fact, she had reportedly asked a local pastor whether he knew of a method to perform an exorcism on their house. These reports painted a picture of a family struggling not only with practical pressures, but also with fears that blurred the line between the physical and the supernatural. Adding to the portrait, friends recounted that Bois and Sherilynn seemed increasingly withdrawn. They were not working steadily due to health and financial issues. Some said they had become thin, frail, and less engaged in the community. Rumors circulated about possible drug use. Methamphetamine was a scourge in rural Oklahoma at the time, and some in the community speculated that the Jamisons might have been involved, either as users or as people entangled with others in the trade. Law enforcement never produced concrete evidence of such activity, but the possibility lingered in the air. For investigators, it was one of several avenues to consider. The surveillance video from the Jamisons' own property added another layer of confusion. That footage, which showed Bois and Sherilynn moving in and out of their home in silence, carrying belongings to their truck, was studied for signs of stress or compulsion. At one point, they made multiple trips back and forth without apparent communication. To some observers, the video suggested they were in a trance-like state. To others, it simply showed two tired adults preparing for a trip in their own idiosyncratic way. For law enforcement, it was inconclusive but unsettling. Sherilynn's bipolar disorder was also a factor investigators could not ignore. Those who knew her acknowledged that she sometimes experienced severe mood swings and depressive episodes. Managing the condition required care and stability, things not always easy to maintain in a household under financial strain. But friends insisted that while she struggled, she was a devoted mother and a protective presence in Madyson's life. They rejected the idea that she would ever willingly abandon her daughter in the woods. Still, investigators had to weigh all possibilities. One theory suggested that Bois and Sherilynn might have entered into a suicide pact, taking their daughter with them. The theory was supported by the couple's history of depression and by vague notes and statements they had made in the past. But it clashed violently with the evidence. Why bring cash if the intention was death? Why abandon their dog in the truck? Why venture into the mountains rather than acting at home? And why leave no farewell message for relatives? For each element that seemed to support the theory, there were more that tore it apart. Another theory pointed toward drugs. The presence of $32,000 in cash was hard to ignore. Law enforcement noted that such amounts were not unusual in large narcotics transactions. Some speculated that the family might have been attempting to purchase drugs or even land tied to drug activity, and were killed by someone they encountered in the mountains. But investigators found no evidence of methamphetamine in their home, no paraphernalia, no records of transactions, and no credible links to dealers. While rumors swirled, hard evidence was missing. A third theory considered the possibility of homicide tied to personal conflict. Bois's estrangement from his father was well known, and relatives told police that disputes between them had been heated. Sherilynn's family also recalled arguments with neighbors. Could the Jamisons have been lured into the mountains by someone they knew? Could they have been ambushed? Investigators questioned relatives, neighbors, and acquaintances, but no one was ever charged. The conflicts were real, but the direct connection to the disappearance could not be proven. And then, there was the element of the paranormal. Some reports said the Jamisons had become increasingly convinced that their home was haunted. Sherilynn had allegedly told friends that she saw spirits, including one of a long-dead family member, and that she felt evil pressing in on them. She had written in her diary about dark forces. For some, these details painted the couple as unstable. For others, they were evidence of genuine fear. Regardless of interpretation, they showed a family living under psychological strain in the weeks before they vanished. For investigators, these threads did not weave into a single explanation. Instead, they formed a tangled web of possibility. Each theory, murder-suicide, drug-related homicide, personal conflict, or psychological breakdown, was examined, but none accounted for every piece of evidence. The abandoned truck, the untouched cash, the dog, the photo of Madyson. Each detail seemed to contradict the others. Meanwhile, the search continued. Teams returned again and again to the Sans Bois Mountains, expanding the radius, using cadaver dogs, probing creeks and ravines. Yet nothing new was found. The mountains seemed to hold the family in silence. The case began to cool. Months passed. Seasons changed. Leads dwindled. The Jamisons' faces appeared on missing persons posters, in local news broadcasts, and on the websites of national organizations. Tips arrived sporadically, each one checked, each one falling short. For the public, fascination persisted. True crime forums lit up with speculation. Some clung to the idea of a botched drug deal. Others insisted the family had been targeted by someone close to them. Still others believed they had been driven by psychological or spiritual forces into the wilderness, where tragedy struck. Each theory reflected not only the facts, but the fears and imagination of those trying to make sense of the senseless. Law enforcement maintained a steady position. The case remained open, active, and without resolution. Investigators spoke carefully when asked by the press, emphasizing the strangeness of the evidence and the absence of conclusive leads. They confirmed that no arrests had been made, no suspects charged, and no single theory held dominance. As the second year passed without resolution, the Jamison case became known less as an active search and more as a haunting question mark in Oklahoma's cold case files. Families in Red Oak remembered the Jamisons as neighbors who had struggled but cared deeply for their daughter. Friends remembered Madyson's smile and the way she clutched her parents' hands. For the investigators who had walked the dirt road, opened the truck, and seen the photograph, the mystery was personal and unsolved. Why did a family with dreams of 40 acres disappear within miles of their own vehicle? Why did they leave behind every tool of survival? And why, in a world of technology and records, did their trail end in silence in the mountains of southeastern Oklahoma? Theories swirled, the evidence refused to answer, and the mystery deepened. The years after the Jamison family's disappearance felt like a slow and steady unwinding of hope. What began as a frantic search in October 2009 settled into routine investigation, punctuated by bursts of attention and long stretches of quiet. Deputies, state investigators, and volunteers kept dossiers and diaries. Leads were chased and discarded. For every promising tip, there were a dozen that led nowhere. The mountain air held its secrets close. The case gathered a peculiar weight. Not only the pain of loss, but the way everyday details, wallets left at home, a dog trapped in a truck, a single haunting photograph, refused to add up to an explanation anyone could accept. In Red Oak and beyond, people repeated the known facts the way one repeats prayers. The truck found on a dirt road in the Sans Bois. The dog inside, emaciated and confused. Wallets, phones, and a bank bag with $32,000 left behind. The photo of Madyson on Bobby's phone, an image that became the public face of the disappearance. Those facts did not change. What changed was the way time made options shrink. A tip that mattered months earlier withered in a year. Memory fogged. The pressure to produce answers grew louder even as evidence grew thinner. Investigators maintained a list of plausible scenarios and pursued them with persistence. They revisited property records, financial ledgers, and medical histories. They examined phone records, reprocessed GPS data, and rewatched surveillance footage for small, telling gestures. Technology advanced over those years, better mapping, more powerful databases. But the central problem remained. The critical moments of that October afternoon were not recorded where investigators needed them most. The lines of inquiry stretched outward like roots, tangling with rumors and recollections that were rarely crisp enough to be evidentiary. Media cycles brought periodic attention. True crime programs profiled the case and national outlets ran features. And when they did, unknown callers spoke up with suggestions and possible sightings. Online message boards flared with speculation. Some commentators fixated on the money. Others latched onto Sherilynn's bipolar diagnosis or anecdotal reports that the couple had said someone was after them. Sensational ideas circulated: cult involvement, ritualistic behavior, staged disappearances, and each idea, however far-fetched, inserted noise into the investigators' work. Still, investigators kept returning to the facts: the truck, the cash, the dog, the photo, and a series of unanswered questions. For neighbors and relatives, the psychological burden took many shapes. Some clung to the hope that Bobby, Sherilynn, and Madyson might be alive somewhere, having fled perceived threats. Others grieved while also demanding accountability. The Jamisons' memory became a constancy. Madyson's toys saved in bins, old photographs re-examined, recipes passed around at memorial gatherings. The public's fascination was not just curiosity. It was a form of communal concern for a family that had become, in an awful way, emblematic of a modern disappearance. Then, in November 2013, the silence cracked. Two hunters moving through a steep, brush-choked hollow less than 3 miles from where the pickup had been recovered came upon human bones scattered among the leaves. At first they thought perhaps an animal had unearthed something old. Then shapes resolved into something worse. The discovery drew forensic teams back into that particular pocket of the Sands Bois with urgency. For those who had followed the case, the news felt like a terrible, long-awaited answer. The hope that someone might still be missing replaced by a more devastating knowledge: the family had died. Forensic teams worked methodically. They mapped the scene, photographed each fragment, and collected the remains with the care demanded by an investigation that could hinge on the smallest detail. The terrain complicated every step. Seasons of weather had shifted leaf litter, exposed bone in places where it might once have been covered, and allowed scavengers to scatter small items. From the initial survey, investigators concluded the remains were consistent with multiple individuals, 2 adults and a child, and they began the mission of identification. DNA analysis eventually confirmed what relatives feared: the bones belonged to Bobby, Sherilynn, and Madyson Jamison. Relief that they were no longer missing was drowned by the pain of finality. The confirmation collapsed the last scaffolding of hope into a concrete grief. For the community, the knowledge that they had perished less than 3 miles from their vehicle produced a fresh wave of disbelief and anger. How could extensive searches have missed them? How could 3 lives be so near to the truck and yet so far from discovery? Autopsies offered little clarity. Weathering and decomposition had stripped soft tissue long before the remains were found, and the skeletal elements revealed no definitive perimortem signs that would explain a cause of death. There were no clear gunshot wounds, no displaced skull fractures, and no consistent pattern of blunt force trauma preserved in bone. Toxicology testing was not possible in a meaningful way after years exposed to the elements. In the medical examiner's final accounting, the cause of death was listed as undetermined. That undetermined label is itself a kind of answer, and a cruel one. It tells us what cannot be known from what remains. It forces investigators and family members to reckon with the limits of forensic science in a landscape that accelerates the decay of evidence. It forces the question of how human beings can disappear unremarked into terrain that is walked repeatedly by searchers. The sober replies include practical realities: weather, animal activity, the slow erosion of physical traces. But those realities are also bitter. They do not satisfy grief, they only constrain it. After the announcement, the public reaction took familiar forms. Some called for accountability and asked why earlier searches had missed the remains. Others suggested incompetence, some even accused concealment. Investigators answered carefully. The Sans Bois country is treacherous. Seasonal changes obscure tracks, and cadaver dogs and human searchers do not guarantee discovery in a single sweep. Teams emphasize that early searches focus on logical corridors and likely routes, but the forest folds can hide even the obvious. The discovery reignited every theory that had been circulating. Foul play moved immediately toward center stage for many. The presence of $32,000 in the truck was a glaring anomaly. If the family carried cash for a land purchase, an inheritance, or some other legitimate reason, then why was it left behind? If it was meant for a transaction, were they meeting someone who planned violence? Investigators explored each variation: the possibility of a staged meeting, an ambush, a grudge-driven assault. They interviewed family, neighbors, and acquaintances, re-examined old arguments, and checked for threats. The trouble remained that bitterness and argument do not by themselves prove murder. Drug-related theories also persisted. Rural Oklahoma had been hard hit by methamphetamine and other illicit market activity in the late 2000s. Cash in that amount sometimes signals drug transactions. Investigators searched for paraphernalia, checked financial trails, and questioned sources known in the local drug economy. They found no irrefutable evidence suggesting the Jamisons were active participants in drug dealing. Rumor, however, is not evidence. It is a pressure on an investigation, and investigators resisted allowing rumor to replace method. Murder-suicide was considered for the obvious reason that both adults had histories of depression and that Sherilynn had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. In closed communities, mental health crises can remain private until tragedy forces them into daylight. But the hypothesis fell short against several facts. Why take so much cash? Why leave a dog in an enclosed vehicle? Why drive into the mountains instead of confronting the home where messages could be left? The tangible contradictions made the theory difficult to sustain. Accidental death remained a persistent, quieter hypothesis. Terrain is relentless. A family could have become disoriented, separated, and succumbed to exposure. Hypothermia and dehydration are stealthy killers. They rob judgment long before they cause collapse. A mother seeking safety for her child can make decisions that seem rational in terror but lead deeper into danger. The problem with accidental death as a complete explanation was the same as with other hypotheses. It does not comfortably explain the presence of the money or the dog being left in the vehicle. Some community members and a few investigators found the reports of the Jamisons feeling watched and speaking of spirits to be a clue about their state of mind. Sherilynn's fears, documented in interviews and diary-like notes, included statements that she believed evil was present in their home. In desperation, she reportedly asked a pastor if an exorcism was possible. For some, such spiritual distress offered a psychological explanation for seemingly irrational behavior. For others, it was an artifact of grief. People look for meaning in the face of an inexplicable loss. That the remains were so close to the truck produced an additional, painful set of questions. How had search teams missed that particular hollow? Were there mistakes in the initial sweeps? Investigators pointed to the nature of the terrain. Gullies can hide small depressions. Wind and rain shift leaves and expose or conceal bone. Scavengers move small items. Searchers may focus on different corridors based on the information available at the time. Those practicalities do not comfort families, but they do shape the reality of search operations. As years passed after the discovery, the Jamison case became an object lesson in the limits of investigation. Police had facts, but not a cohesive narrative. The community had memory, but not cause. The remains provided certainty that the family had died, but not how they died. Detectives continued to check new leads, to retest old evidence as technology allowed, and to bring the case for renewed attention when plausible tips emerged. They compared trace evidence to national databases, they re-interviewed acquaintances, and they followed confessions and recantations with the procedural rigor the law requires. None of these efforts produced a charge. For relatives, the discovery was both relief and torment. They finally had a place to bury their grief, but no explanation to bury along with it. Memory work took over in the smallest rituals, visiting Madyson's favorite playground, returning to quiet traditions, telling stories that preserve the child's presence in everyday talk. The public, too, did its part. The photo of Madyson remained circulated in posts and articles, not as a puzzle to be commodified, but as an image of a child who had lived and who now had been taken. Theories multiplied and braided together, each one carrying part of the sensible narrative and part of the unreasonable. Motive could be greed. Motive could be rage. Motive could be desperation. Each hypothesis, foul play, drug involvement, murder-suicide, paranormal fear, accident, fit some pieces of evidence and contradicted others. That multiplicitous fit is the cruel shape of many cold cases. Several plausible stories exist, none wholly reconciling the known facts. Public interest never entirely died. Podcasts and online essays periodically re-examined the case, sparking new tips. Family members urged continued attention and were careful to protect private memories from sensational retellings. Investigators kept the file active. The Jamisons' names appeared on lists of unsolved mysteries that rally amateur sleuths and professionals alike, because unsolved cases often require the persistent attention of many minds. As months became years, the Jamison family's story also became a teacher about investigative humility. It taught about search methodology and the need for repeated sweeps in difficult terrain. It taught about how quickly rumor can harden into accepted narrative and how stubbornly memory resists clarity with time. It taught about forensic limits when biochemical traces have dissipated. Above all, it taught that victims are more than collections of clues and that respectful persistence matters. The medical examiner's pronouncement of undetermined cause of death is a blunt reminder of what evidence can and cannot do after time removes so much of it. For investigators, it is a technical verdict with legal implications. For relatives, it is a sentence that refuses closure. For the public, it is a moral puzzle. How to accept finality when cause remains obscure. The absence of an answer is itself an absence that must be held with dignity. The Jamison case rests at an uncomfortable intersection between knowledge and uncertainty. It prompts the questions everyone asks when faced with a similar riddle. Why would a family leave a vehicle containing means of survival? Why take a child into dense woods and never return? What did the haunting photograph of Madyson capture in her expression that the rest of the evidence could not explain? Those questions have not been rhetorical. They have been practical and ongoing requests for any new memory, any overlooked piece of evidence. For those who loved Bois, Sherilynn, and Madyson, the story is not an intellectual exercise. It is a living wound. They deserve dignity and thoroughness, accurate reporting, careful investigation, and the hope that one day a small, overlooked fact will provide the crucial link to accountability. The Jamisons' names deserve to be treated with care rather than reduced to fodder for speculation. Investigators continue their work in small increments, revisiting terrain, reprocessing old data, and rechecking leads with new forensic techniques when possible. Sometimes progress arrives in fragments. A traffic record reinterpreted, a witness recollection suddenly clarified, a partial DNA match that opens new avenues. The process is slow. The answers, should they come, will likely come incrementally. For now, the mountains keep their silence. The case remains open. The photograph of a child, the proximity of bones to an abandoned truck, the bank bag with $32,000, and the undetermined medical ruling form a constellation of details that refuses a single, tidy conclusion. They form instead a plea, that memories be preserved, that questions be pursued, and that the Jamison family be remembered as people first and as a cold case second. Relatives and investigators alike urge anyone with even the smallest recollection, an odd tire mark, an out-of-place fire pit, a voice remembered in a bar on that October day, to come forward. Small facts can reshape cold files. The Jamisons' names deserve more than speculation. They deserve answers derived from evidence and care. Please look again. Someone knows something. Speak up for Madyson, Bois, and Sherilynn. The Jamison family's story does not end neatly. It does not give us the satisfaction of solved mysteries or the comfort of explanations. Instead, it leaves us staring into the vastness of the unknown, just as investigators, family, and friends have been forced to do for more than a decade. Their remains were found, their lives confirmed lost, but their truth still hidden. What really happened that October day in 2009? Did someone lead them into those woods and leave them there? Did fear and mental illness drive them away from safety? Was it a chance accident, the wilderness swallowing them whole, with no intent beyond misfortune? Each theory paints a different ending, but none resolves the unease. That unease is what has kept this case alive, whispered about in true crime forums, revisited in documentaries, dissected by podcasts, and analyzed by everyday people who just want to understand. Because in the Jamison case, it is not just about what happened to them. It's about what their story says about us, about how fragile our safety can be, about how quickly the line between ordinary life and unexplainable tragedy can be crossed. Sherilynn's journal entries about spirits, Bobby's quiet despair, little Madyson's innocent photograph, all of it gives us fragments of people who were alive, real, complex, and searching for something. And then, suddenly, gone. We want answers. We want closure. But sometimes, in the cold world of unsolved cases, all we are left with is the echo of silence. For the Jamison family, the silence is permanent. But for us, it's a call to remember. Every unsolved case has lessons. Every mystery is also a story of people, of parents, children, and communities. And every story reminds us of the urgency of truth, the value of vigilance, and the reality that justice delayed is justice denied. If there is one thing to take away from the Jamisons' disappearance, it is that unresolved stories leave ripples. Ripples in families, in law enforcement, in towns, and in the public imagination. Those ripples never fade until the truth surfaces. And perhaps, one day, it still might. Until then, the Jamison case remains one of Oklahoma's most haunting cold cases. But we won't let it be forgotten. If you were drawn in by this story, if you felt the weight of its mystery, the grief of its silence, and the need for answers, then you're in the right place. This is Cold Case 48, where we don't just tell stories, we uncover them. Together, we give voice to the lost, attention to the overlooked, and light to the shadows. Subscribe now and join a community that refuses to let the unsolved fade away. Hit like if you believe the Jamisons deserve justice. Comment your theory below. Was it foul play, accident, or something stranger? I want to hear what you think happened. Because here, the story doesn't end when the video does. It continues in the discussion we create together. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never forget, every cold case is waiting for someone to finally break the silence.